Hello, my name is Natascha Otoya, and I'm interviewing Professor John McNeill. Professor John McNeill is an environmental historian considered one of the pioneers in the field, and he's a professor at Georgetown University, where he teaches both at the history department and the School of Foreign Service. Professor McNeill got his MA and his PhD at Duke University and has written several books since then. His most famous works are Mosquitoes Empire, An Ecology of War in the Great Caribbean, Something New Under the Sun, An Environmental History of the 20th Century World, and most recently, in collaboration with his former student Peter Engelke, The Great Acceleration, An Environmental History of the Anthropocene since 1945. Thank you very much for joining us today, Professor. So I'd like to start by talking about the field of environmental history, because I know that a lot of us are not very familiar with it, and this is, to some of us, has been like the first encounter with environmental history. So I think it would be helpful for Professor McNeill to sort of outline the trajectory of the field, and also talk about your father's influence in your work. Professor McNeill's father was William McNeill. Also, world history or global? Would you call it like global history or?
He would have said
world history. Yes, I was reading about him okay, and so about the trajectory of the field and your work. Where do you fit in, and the influences in general?
Okay, so I'll speak first about environmental history as a self-conscious sub-discipline within the profession of history. It dates to the late 1970s. Like a lot of sub-disciplines, it owes its existence to currents in broader society. That is, the modern surge of environmentalism seeped into academic history and gave rise to environmental history. As a self-conscious sub-discipline, it originated more in the United States than anywhere else. And within that, it originated mainly in Western history, history of the Western states. And it had and still has a strong current of Western wilderness and national parks history to it, at least as practiced in the United States. And the emphasis on parks is transnational. There's many environmental historians that work on parks and conservation in many settings around the world, from China to Russia to Brazil. There are at present roughly 3,000 people in the world who self-describe as environmental historians, about half of them in the US. The issues that they have concerned themselves with have evolved somewhat since the late 1970s. For example, they have taken on urban environmental history, questions of pollution, of so-called environmental justice in urban settings. That, I would say, is also stronger in the United States than it is in any other context, although I think that's changing fast. The parts of the world where environmental history is most active and attracts the most practitioners include India, Northern Europe, and Australia, Canada too, as well as the United States. And there are a few places where it's practiced, but not by people from the region. So Middle East environmental history is practiced mainly by people from outside the Middle East. African environmental history practiced mainly by people outside of Africa. But African environmental history has been pretty active for 30 years now. Very high quality work. And lastly, I would say that environmental history, although born out of concern about environmental issues, has, outside of India and Latin America, gotten increasingly apolitical. And the sense of commitment and motivation that attracted people to it in the 1970s and 1980s has weakened. It hasn't disappeared, but it has weakened. Although I would say in India and Latin America that is not true. People who are attracted to it are overwhelmingly attracted to it because they feel it's a way to weigh in politically on issues they care about. How's that for an introduction to environmental history?
That is very good.
Okay, so the second thing you asked me about was my dad. My father was a historian, practiced his trade at the University of Chicago for 40 years. He described himself as a historian without portfolio, or a world historian. And he wrote one book that some people regard as environmental history. He did not. That book is called Plagues and Peoples, published in the late 70s. It's an attempt at a global history of epidemic disease over the last 200,000 years. And a lot of people have read it. I happen to know what the sales figures are because my father is no longer in the land of the living and I have to deal with his affairs. So that includes dealing with publishers. 150,000 people bought that book, which is great. I don't know how many actually read it. But neither he nor I, nor most environmental historians would consider that a work of environmental history. It does have some components of ecology in it because some important epidemic diseases are, so to speak, environmental diseases that circulate not merely among human bodies but in environments as well. But that was only incidental to his interest in disease. And you asked me, I think you asked me about his influence upon me. The older I get, the more I think I see that in a number of respects. First of all, I too occasionally practice world-scale history, which is not something that anybody's taught to do in graduate school. In fact, people are normally actively discouraged from doing that in graduate school. And I didn't do it in graduate school, but I have done it since. And I expect that a big reason for that is my father's influence. It could also be true that my ambition to write books that ordinary people can understand also derives from him, although I write in a somewhat more demotic fashion than he did. But he held in contempt historians who wrote in codes that deliberately excluded readers. And I'm not quite as contemptuous, but I'm still firmly opposed to writing in jargon that ordinary people can't understand. And I may have acquired that from him, although I think I could more likely have acquired that from my mother, whose contempt was even greater. So that's the way I see it.
Okay. Now, yeah, so this ties in nicely with my next question, which is like something that Professor Sand had brought up before, like the challenges of making history on this global planetary scale. How do you go about finding sources? Is there like a lot of traveling involved, and do you have to go to all these places? What do you do in terms of languages if you're going to read? Like you in your book, you talk about so many different countries. I mean, I'm wondering, how do you get to read all the information in all the language? Do you stick to stuff that has been published in English? Or also, how do you make decisions in what, if you're talking about the world, the whole world, how do you make decisions in what to include and what to leave out? And this comes personally from the feeling that I'm slightly underrepresented in your book as a Latin American. And I just wish, and I just see, I understand sort of the rationale behind it, because if a lot of the division in the book is like capitalism and socialism, and then, you know, the Cold War. So it's sort of, but how do you make that decision? If the whole point is to talk about the history of, on a global scale, how do you decide what's globally important enough to get to the pages of the book and what's not?
I don't think those decisions are any harder than the decisions that you face if you write about anything for which there's abundant information. I mean, there are things you can write about for which information is sparse, and you can include every single snippet of extant information, in which case problems of inclusion and exclusion don't exist. But for most historical subjects that are interesting enough to write about, you face problems of what to put in and what to leave out. And I don't think those problems are any harder for global scale history than they are for smaller scale history. It's the same intellectual exercise. And the way I think about it and talk about it with students is to think of all the things that you could possibly say as the equivalent of a big block of marble. And then you chip away at that big block of marble, leaving out everything you can afford to leave out while still conveying your message, whatever it is, and not cluttering it up with extraneous material. And if you chip away and leave only the message, ideally you have the equivalent of a statue, something that is meaningful, maybe even something that is beautiful. Well, that might be too much to ask. Instead of assembling all the things that you think you might wish to say, you contemplate all the things that you might wish to say, and then you chip away, discard, discard, discard. That's the way I think of it. If I'm writing a textbook, which I have just done, I would think hard about representation and inclusion, make sure there's enough about Latin America in there. But if I'm writing about a theme, I would not seriously concern myself with that. I would want to explicate the theme, and whether the examples come from Australia or from Brazil would be irrelevant to me.
Okay.
But I would be looking for examples that support the argument that I'm trying to make and that are interesting stories to tell. And that matters to me as well. There are some historians to whom it does not matter, but it does matter to me.
And sources and languages, and how long does it take to write about the whole world? Or
so, unlike the way that you are being trained and should be trained, in which you learn to handle primary sources in original languages, world history is not done that way. There's roughly 6,000 or 7,000 languages spoken on the face of the earth, and none of us is going to learn as much as 1% of those languages. And so world history is normally written from secondary sources. It can be done from lots of different languages. When I wrote Something New Under the Sun, which is an attempt at global scale history, there's probably 6 or 8, maybe 10 languages in the bibliography. And I struggled with works in languages that I don't know well, which is just about every language. But for the Great Acceleration, which to some extent was written on the back of Something New Under the Sun, I hardly read anything. Because I knew these stories pretty well. And as you'll note, there's very little in the way of documentation in this book. So the answer is these things are done differently depending on one's intended audience and one's ambitions, but it's never done on the basis of primary documents in original languages. That's a different kind of history, which I think everybody should learn to do, but it's not the way that world history is done. It would be extremely impractical to attempt to write world history or global history that way.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So one of the things that I was most struck by in the book was the emphasis on urban environment and urban landscape, because initially when you started talking about the field of environmental history, though, there's a big chunk of people who are doing like conservation. And so when I first started reading and when I first heard about environmental history, I also thought it was like the history of nature, or you know, like connections and stuff, but not, I didn't see urban landscape as like the primary place to analyze environmental, to talk about, or to produce environmental history. But since then I've learned that it's very much connected. And so I'd like you to talk about this, this idea, because is urban environmental history separate? Is it a subfield of environmental history, which is already like a subfield of history? Or how do you view these connections, like urban ideas within environmental history?
So it is something of a subspecialization within environmental history, although there are plenty of people who sometimes write about cities and sometimes write about other things. And I would say that there are comparatively few who focus only on cities, although I can think of one or two. So it's a subspecialty that people drift in and out of. It's well represented in this book for two reasons. One is that Peter Engelke came out of an urban planning background. He wrote his dissertation on urban environmental history, basically on the management of traffic and pedestrian spaces in some German cities. And also because I was under the influence of the fact that sometime around 2010, this is mentioned in the book, the 50% threshold had been surpassed. And this struck me as interesting, that in some respects a new phase in human history, not merely environmental history, but human history generally, in which we are now, for the first time, primarily an urban animal. And I suspect that that has all sorts of meanings beyond environmental ones that we will come to understand in the fullness of time, but are hard to understand in the moment.